Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating Patient-Reported Outcomes, Foundational Elements and Recent Trends, presented by Cardinal Health. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor to Fierce Markets, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Todd Phillips, Director, Global Regulatory Affairs at Cardinal Health Regulatory Sciences, and Marjorie Zettler, Senior Scientist, Cardinal Health Regulatory Sciences. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Before we begin, just a few technical notes. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Resources List button at the bottom of your screen. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentation with a Q&A session, and you can submit questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen, and you can do that throughout the presentation. I think that pretty much takes care of it. We're ready to begin. Todd, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joe, and many thanks for that introduction. I wanted to welcome everyone to our PRO webinar. Increasingly, PROs are becoming critical elements in the decision-making process for regulators, payers, and providers, and therefore understanding the foundational elements of patient-reported outcomes and recent regulatory trends is critical. This presentation is a first in a series of 3 webinars where we'll be exploring various topics associated with patient-reported outcomes. During our presentation today, we'll review FDA's thinking and perspective on patient experience data, including current and future initiatives intended to expand the use of these data in FDA regulatory decision-making processes. In addition, we'll also provide a high-level overview of the PRO instrument development process within the context of an individual development program. And lastly, we'll examine recent use of patient-reported outcome data across a number of therapeutic areas and how often the PRO claims were incorporated into product labeling. So prior to exploring the different regulatory pathways available to sponsors interested in pursuing a PRO into their development program, and considering the concepts associated with instrument development, I thought it would be a good idea to provide an overview of the agency's current thinking regarding patient experience data and the initiatives, both recently completed and future activities specific to these type of data. But before we explore these initiatives, let's start with how the FDA defines a PRO. So a PRO is a measurement based on any report coming directly from the patient about the status of their health condition without any amendment or interpretation by a clinician or anyone else for that matter. The outcome can be measured in absolute terms, so a good example would be severity of symptoms, sign, or state of disease, or as a change from a previous measure. And these data can be used to evaluate the treatment benefit of a product or risk in the context of a clinical trial and to support labeling claims. Some good examples of PROs would include pain intensity, seizure episodes, asthma symptoms, GI symptoms, rescue medication use, and health-related quality of life. So now that we've reviewed the definition of PRO, let's dive into FDA's perspective on patient experience data. So this slide captures a quote provided by Janet Woodcock that she made during the PDUFA V Clinical Outcomes Assessments Public Workshop in 2015. And I'll read it here because I really do think it has bearing on the agency's thinking then, and certainly will have context and is appropriate for their thinking now. So let's read the quote here. So it turns out that what is really bothering the patient and what is really bothering the doctor can be radically different things. Patients are true experts in their disease, and it's clear you have to start with an understanding of the impact of the disease on the people who have it and what they value most in terms of alleviation before you set up a measurement and go forward with truly patient-focused drug development. So another way to think about these concepts that she introduced in that quote is patient experience data or patient input into the development program really helps FDA determine what is measured to provide clinical benefit, how best to measure the concepts in a clinical study, and what a meaningful improvement in the clinical benefit would be. So I believe this quote, as I mentioned earlier, really reinforces the agency's thinking about patient experience data then, and also is a good context to provide their thinking on current and future directives. And so as a part of that last part of her quote, she focused on patient-focused drug development. So what is patient-focused drug development from the agency's perspective? So patient-focused drug development, or PFDD, is a systematic approach to help ensure that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured in a meaningful, incorporated into the drug development evaluation. So basically the primary goal is to better incorporate the patient's voice into the regulatory decision-making process at FDA. And so in order to better understand the current and forthcoming FDA initiatives associated with these data, let's begin the discussion by evaluating activities that have recently been completed by the agency under PDUFA V. So in an effort to capture the patient's perspective on their disease and conditions, FDA over the period of 2013 to 2017 conducted 24 disease-specific PFDD meetings with the intent of exploring and collecting input directly from the patient across a variety of disease states in order to better understand how they think of their disease and how they think of the treatments associated with the disease. So this slide here captures in a tabular format the different types of disease states that were covered from 2013 to 2017. As you can see, there's a wide range of disease states and conditions that were covered, ranging from chronic fatigue syndrome to inborn errors of metabolism, psoriasis, and autism. And so the agency really made a concerted effort during this time period to explore numerous disease states and really understand how the patients think about their diseases and think about their treatments. And so for each of these PFDD meetings, the output was at least a report called the Voice of the Patient report. And all of these reports are accessible on FDA's website. And really the report summarizes the input provided by the patients and the patient representatives for each of these public meetings. So they're a great repository for how the patients think about their disease and how they think about the treatments in the context of these diseases. So in addition to the FDA-led PFDD meetings, and to help expand the benefits of this initiative overall, the agency encouraged external stakeholders to organize patient-focused collaborations with the intent of generating public input in other disease areas not covered by the FDA during the period of 2013 to 2017. So interested stakeholders could conduct these meetings, but before they could conduct these meetings, they were required to submit a letter of intent approximately 1 year in advance of the meeting. The letter of intent would cover various topics such as the proposed disease area, the purpose of the meeting, the goals of the meeting, the objectives, the target patient population, and the planned meeting format such as in-person, webinar, or patient testimonials and things of that nature. So for each of these meetings, FDA determined on a case-by-case basis, and this was the group within CDER's Office of Strategic Programs. They would coordinate an internal review of the letters of intent on a quarterly schedule, and the meeting results and outputs are not considered to be FDA sponsored or binding. I think that's a critical element to think of. So even though they were collecting data on behalf of the patients, and I think they will consider these data in their decision-making process, none of the outputs were regulatorily binding from FDA's perspective. So an example of a few of these disease states that were included in the external PFDD meetings were amyloidosis back in 2015, lupus in 2017, and osteoarthritis in March of 2017. So in addition to the PFDD meetings that were conducted over this period of time, the 21st Century Cures Act, which was signed into law in 2016, emphasized the need for patient engagement and directed the agency to include the patient's voice in drug development process and in the regulatory decision-making process. So on this slide, I really wanted to draw your attention to the mandates specific to the development of patient-focused guidance, and that would be under Section 3002, in addition to the issuance of reports assessing the use of PE data in regulatory decisions, and that was dictated under Section 3004. Over the next few slides, we'll be unpacking the requirements around patient-focused guidance documents and exploring FDA's current activities as well as future activities associated with these guidance. But of interest, as it relates to the patient experience drug development report, the first report that FDA is required to issue is on the 1st of June 2021, and then subsequently every 5 years thereafter. So further to the mandates of the Cures Act, the need for patient-focused drug development is reinforced by the PDUFA VI reauthorization performance goals. And so I think the interesting point of note on this particular slide is the FDA's concerted effort underneath PDUFA VI to strengthen the staff capacity to facilitate the development and use of patient-focused methods to inform regulatory decisions, to develop guidance documents to bridge the PFF or PFDD meetings for the purpose of drug development tools, and then also to foster the development of PRO measures within the rare disease or orphan populations. So as I touched upon earlier in my previous two slides, FDA has been tasked with developing multiple guidance documents over the next few years to advance the use of patient experience data. These guidance documents build on the learnings from the disease-specific PFDD meetings that were conducted as a part of PDUFA V, so over the period of 2013 to 2017. And briefly, let's just discuss from a high-level standpoint the questions that each of these guidance documents will be intended to answer. And as of note, guidance number 1, actually the draft version, was issued in June of 2018. But this particular guidance document is intended to answer the questions of whom do you get input from and why, and how do you collect the information. Guidance number 2 asks the questions or answers the questions, what do you ask and why? How do you ask non-leading questions that are well understood by a wide range of patients and others? And guidance number 3 is intended to answer the questions, how do you decide what to measure in the clinical trial and select or develop fit-for-purpose clinical outcomes assessments? And guidance number 4, which has yet to obtain a title, is intended to answer the questions, so once you have a COA measurement tool and a way to collect these data, what is an appropriate clinical trial endpoint? And it's good to note that for guidance 2, 3, and 4, FDA will be conducting public workshops this October to further discuss topics that will be defined in these guidance documents. So now that we've reviewed FDA's perspective on patient experience data and evaluated recent activities and future mandates specific to these types of data, during the next portion of the presentation, I would like to explore and unpack the regulatory pathways that sponsors interested in incorporating a patient-reported outcome tool in their development program can consider. However, but before we jump into that portion of the presentation, I do think it's beneficial just to take a step back and briefly review the agency's current thinking specific to drug development tools in general. So in general, the drug development tool from the agency's perspective is really just a measurement or method that aids in drug development. And good examples of these types of tools include biomarkers, animal models, particularly if you're in an animal rule context in your development program, and clinical outcomes assessments. So for the remainder of the presentation, we're going to focus in the clinical outcomes assessment arena. And specifically, a COA is really a measure of a patient's symptoms, overall mental state, or the effects of a disease or condition on how the patient feels or functions. And so COAs can be used to determine whether or not a drug has been demonstrated to provide a treatment benefit. A COA is composed of a measure that produces a score, together with a clearly defined method and instructions for administering the tool and assessing a response. There's always a standard format for data collection and a well-documented means for methods for scoring, analysis, and interpretation of the results in the targeted patient population. So assessment of a clinical outcome assessment can be made through a variety of individuals evaluating the symptoms, those being patient patients, non-clinician observer, or through a performance-based assessment. And so of note, choosing the type of COA, that being one of the four that's presented here on this slide, really depends on a determination of the most appropriate reporter for the concept of interest and the context of use. So during the next few slides, let's unpack these topics of concept of interest as well as context of use. The concept of interest is simply nothing more than the measurement, what you're measuring by the PRO instrument. Concept of interest is represented by a treatment score. Oops, sorry, a little lagging on my slide there. So just to repeat, the concept of interest is represented by an instrument score, and it really forms the basis of interpreting your clinical trials and the treatment benefit that you would communicate in the product labeling. And I do want to emphasize at this point in the presentation that identification of that concept of interest is essential before you can start the selection or development of the assessment tool. So it's very important that you define the COA before you get into the process of developing the tool. The context of use is just really a statement describing the way the patient-reported outcome is to be used and the drug development-related purpose of its use. So when sponsors sit down and start considering what type of context of use would be most meaningful for their drug development program, you really should consider the disease state, the subtypes and the severities, the patient subpopulations, that being demographics, ability to report symptoms, culture, language, things of that nature, the clinical practice by which this particular concept of interest is evaluated, and the clinical trial designs associated with how you would proceed with your development program. So good examples of context of use, and just to provide some framework on how to think about this, would be adult patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension, or another way to think about it in a different population would be pediatric ulcerative colitis in children's ages 4 through 18 with all disease activity states. So currently there are 3 pathways by which a sponsor interested in pursuing PRO development into their drug development program can receive guidance and advice specific to that PRO from the agency. And these 3 are within an individual product development program, or using the formal COA qualification pathway, or in addition to those, utilizing the critical path innovation meeting pathway. The 2 of these pathways, that being the COA qualification and the CPIM meetings, are outside of an individual development program. So over the next few slides, we're going to unpack these particular pathways, and we'll start with the COA qualification pathway. The COA qualification just represents a conclusion by the agency that with the stated context of use, patient-reported outcome can be relied upon to have a specific interpretation and application in drug development and regulatory review. The qualification of a drug development tool, or as an example, a patient-reported outcome instrument, is specific for the context of use, and the qualified drug development tool may be used for the context of use by any person developing a drug or biologic. The qualification doesn't pertain to the process of review of a PRO within the context of an individual drug development program. It's a separate program, and qualification is independent of an individual drug development program. And so FDA's clinical outcomes assessment staff manage the qualification program and participate in the COA qualification review team, which includes representatives from the appropriate review divisions, the Office of Biostatistics, and the COA staff was previously known as the Study Endpoints and Labeling Development Team, or the SEAL team. Of interest, the current Cures Act of 2016 mandated that FDA establish a qualification process for drug development tools, but it's of note that this formal mandate that came through the Cures Act was actually just building upon activities that FDA had been engaging in for a number of years in a voluntary fashion. The Cures Act simply just formalized the activities that the agency had been participating in for a number of years. However, it is the agency's goal to transition from the legacy qualification program to the process that's defined by the Cures Act. And so FDA is currently developing a transition plan for existing projects, as well as to dictate what new submissions into this particular program, the requirements associated with those types of submissions. So in terms of the COA qualification process and outcome, let's unpack some of those activities associated with these topics. So CDER, or FDA, will prioritize which COA qualification proposals are accepted into the program, and specifically they may consider the following topics or themes when they're evaluating the proposals, such as, does the COA fill a critical measurement gap within the medical community? Or does the proposed COA represent a significant improvement over currently available or accepted drug development tools? And is the submitter willing to develop a new tool or modify an existing tool as needed based on existing or new research findings? So the qualification process is built upon 3 submissions, the first one being the letter of intent, the second being the qualification plan, and third, finally, the full qualification package. So it is important to note here that the Cures Act, as well as the practices that FDA had been engaged in prior to the passage of the statute, includes a transparency provision that applies to the requester's submissions, the FDA's formal written determinations of the package, and so FDA will post these documents and their formal reviews to their website. And these documents that will be posted to the website include the letter of intent, the qualification plan, the full qualification package, and their qualification decisions. So at this point in the presentation, we just want to take a moment and pause and throw a question out to the audience. Before we review what type of COAs have been formally qualified by the agency, wanted to get the audience's opinion regarding what percentage of the FDA-qualified clinical outcome assessments are patient-reported outcomes. All right, so let's take a look at what the audience has provided. So 75% of the audience stated that 25% of those qualified by FDA were PROs. An additional 12.5 said 50%, and 75% from an additional 12.5. So let's look at the result here. And so this slide captures in a tabular format the instruments that have been qualified by FDA, and all of them, so 100% have been PROs as far as the type of COA instrument. And so these have typically, or these 4 have been across pulmonary disease, major depressive disorder, and in non-small cell lung cancer. I think it's interesting to put this slide into context to note that since 2010, 34 submissions, last I counted, have been accepted by FDA into the formal qualification program, 4 of whom have been formally qualified by FDA, and these assessments are available out on FDA's website. But it is of note, and I find it very interesting, that 100% of these tools that have been qualified are patient-reported outcome tools. So let's now shift gears and talk about the Critical Path Innovation Meeting. And this represents the second pathway that I outlined on that slide that showed the 3 buckets of the pathways. And so this is, as I mentioned, the second pathway by which a sponsor can receive guidance from FDA specific to a PRO. So the goal of this type of meeting is really to discuss the methodology and technology proposed by the requester, and really to obtain general feedback from the agency on that methodology. So it can also be a venue for discussing potential approaches to developing the PRO tool and to provide evidence of treatment benefit to support the marketing and approval of labeling claims. But I do think it's worth noting that FDA will not give specific regulatory advice on product development programs. They won't review specific data associated with your development program. But to really put this meeting into context as well, the CPIMs are really not intended to substitute any formal meetings that you would have with FDA, such as pre-IND, into phase 2, or things of that nature. It's really just a format by which you can introduce the topic of your patient-reported outcome to the agency and obtain some high-level input. So some other things that you could consider discussing with the agency at a CPIM meeting include natural history study designs, innovative conceptual approaches to clinical trial design and analyses, as well as biomarkers that you would have of interest in obtaining high-level input from the agency. The CPI meetings typically last around 90 minutes in duration, and following the meeting, the FDA staff will share a brief, high-level summary of the meeting discussion with all the meeting participants and the topic of area. And the topic of the CPM meeting is also posted on FDA's website. FDA will send the meeting summary to the requester within about 60 days of completing the meeting. So interested parties can request a CPIM meeting by completing a simple one-page form that's available on FDA's website. And once FDA receives the request, CPIM staff will evaluate it to determine the appropriate venue. If the CPI meeting is not the appropriate venue, they'll recommend the appropriate path that they believe the sponsor should take at this point in time, given their development pathway. Acceptance of the CPI meeting request is dependent upon the relevance of the topic and the ability of FDA to put the adequate resources needed to accomplish that meeting. So if, in fact, the CPIM is the best platform for discussion at that point in time in your development program, CDER will request a preparation package, and that's typically about 2 weeks in advance of the meeting. And the content of the package from a very high-level standpoint would be the objective of the meeting, proposed agenda, presentation slides, and proposed attendees and respective affiliations. So now that we've discussed the two pathways that are outside of an individual development program, I'd like to focus on the third pathway, and that would be the individual development program, and how that particular pathway is evaluated, or how FDA would review a patient-reported outcome within the context of that pathway. And so for the remainder of my portion of the presentation, I'll use this individual development pathway as a platform to provide high-level overview of the concepts, activities, and other associated items that are linked to the development of a PRO instrument. So when FDA first looks at a PRO instrument in this context, with the specific intent to support labeling claims, they'll often consider items such as population enrolled in your clinical trials, or the population you would like to enroll in your clinical trials, the clinical trial objectives and designs, the instrument's conceptual framework, and the instrument's measurement properties. So the population enrolled in the trial and the trial objectives and the design of the study, in my mind, really define the context of use, which we've already previously discussed earlier in my presentation. So over the next few slides, we'll unpack the instrument's conceptual framework and the measurement properties associated with that particular instrument. But before we get into those particular topics, I do think it's important just to define what I believe in terms of a PRO instrument. And that's simply nothing more than a means to capture the data, such as a questionnaire, plus all the information and documentation to support its use. And that documentation generally includes defined methods, instructions for administering or responding to the question, standard data collection format, and well-documented methods for scoring, analysis, and interpretation of the results in the target population. The development of this particular PRO instrument includes qualitative and quantitative evaluations and assessments that identify and measure outcomes reported by the patient. So use of a PRO, as I reiterated in a few slides before this one, is really recommended when measuring the concept of interest that is best known by the patient or best measured from the patient's perspective. Let's unpack the conceptual framework. So the conceptual framework is a really good way to think about it. It's a high-level framework that really defines the concepts measured by the instrument. So the concepts could be symptoms, the relationship between the concept and the items, as well as the sub-concepts in relationship to the items. And so the conceptual framework of a PRO instrument will evolve over time throughout the development program. And the complexity of this framework is really dependent upon the concept of interest, the number of subdomains, and the items of use. So if you've got a disease state that is defined by a constellation of symptoms, all of which are important to adequately define that disease state, the instrument that you're developing will need to address all of those symptoms that are relevant to the disease state and also relevant to the patient moving forward. So let's continue the discussion around the measurement properties of a PRO instrument. So during the evaluation of a PRO, FDA will consider the measurement properties of the tool. And the measurement properties are attributes relevant to the application of a PRO, and these include validity, both content and construct, reliability, and the ability to detect change. So instrument measurement properties should be established prior to initiating your confirmatory trials. And so over the next few slides, we'll evaluate each measurement property. So let's talk about content validity. And that's just simply the extent to which the instrument measures the concept of interest. Content validity is established using many different ways, such as literature review, expert opinion, and respondent input from qualitative interviews, and those would be mainly concept elicitation and cognitive interviews. It's of value to note that the content validity of the instrument is specific to the population, the condition, and the treatment, and the content validity should be established for evaluating other measurement properties of the instrument, such as reliability, construct validity, and the ability to detect change. So another way to think about this in terms of timing of your development program is ideally you need to establish content validity prior to the initiation of your phase 2 trials. So let's just briefly discuss the additional measurement properties that FDA will evaluate when they're looking at your patient-reported outcome instrument. So first they're going to look at reliability, well actually not first, but they will look at reliability, construct validity, and ability to detect change. One thing I do want to reiterate in terms of evaluating these additional measurement properties or the quantitative testing of the instrument, we recommend that these be done in advance of your phase 3 or confirmatory trials. We highly recommend that just to avoid having to go back and repeat any of the instrument validation that has been done up to that point if during the phase 3 trials you receive information back on the performance of the instrument, and then that would then necessitate the completion of the development process of that instrument in a subsequent phase 3 trial. So just briefly, when I think of reliability, I think of test-retest reliability. So really assessing the stability of scores over time when no change is expected in the concept of interest. And when I think about ability to detect change, it's really evaluating the instrument. Can that instrument identify differences in scores over time in individuals or groups that have changed with respect to the measurement concept? So now let's switch gears and just discuss some topics around both PRO instrument modification and also special populations that you need to consider when you're developing one of these instruments. So the adequacy of your PRO instrument is really dependent upon the development and testing specific to the application of use, the population, the condition, and other aspects of the measurement context for which the instrument was developed. So when you modify a PRO instrument during the development process, you need to consider the evidence that you would need to address those modifications. So a good example of modifications that could warrant additional evaluation would be if you change the format of your PRO instrument from a paper to an electronic-based format, or if you changed items within that particular instrument, such as the wording, response times, or recall period. So let's briefly discuss some special or specific populations that require attention for sponsors when they're developing drugs that require a patient-reported outcome instrument to adequately evaluate their disease state. And the first one that I really want to focus on is the pediatric population. And you can imagine if you're developing your patient-reported outcome instrument in the adult population, the questions are specific to that population. How they respond is very specific to that population. So if you then switch gears and look at pursuing a development program within the pediatric age group, and that can be 16 years of age all the way down to 1 month of age, let's say for example, the types of questions you can ask and the responses that you'll receive within the pediatric population can be very different than what the adult population would respond. So you have to consider how you would develop the PRO instrument within the context of a pediatric program. And so this has relevance for a number of our sponsors that are pursuing programs in the adult population. The nature of the program that they're pursuing will necessitate or trigger the requirements for evaluating a pediatric program as well due to PREA. And so when you're looking at PRO development in the context of an adult, we strongly recommend that sponsors consider the development of PROs in other populations, such as pediatric populations. The other one I wanted to touch on in this particular slide is culture or language. And so many development programs are multinational in scale, and therefore the use of PRO instruments in multiple cultures or language is fairly common in the drug development process. And so FDA recommends that sponsors provide evidence that the content validity or other measurement properties are adequately similar between all versions used in these clinical trials. So this concludes my portion of the presentation. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Zettler, where she'll be exploring the use of patient-reported outcome data across a number of therapeutic areas, and also how these data were ultimately incorporated into the product labeling.
Thank you, Todd. Let's not go to the polling question quite yet. I'll just go back one. For this section of the presentation, I'm going to be focused on patient-reported outcome labeling claims. Just about 9 years ago, the FDA issued their final guidance on the use of PRO measures to support labeling claims as one of the means of incorporating the patient's perspective into the drug approval process. So this guidance provides information on evaluating a PRO instrument, either a newly existing one or a newly developed one, an existing one or a newly developed one, designing a clinical trial in which that instrument is used to capture the patient's experience, and then analyzing the resulting data from that trial in such a way that it can be used to support a claim. So then, before we get into it, we have another polling question for you, and that's what percentage of warning letters and untitled letters issued by the FDA in recent years were for violations related to PRO promotional claims? What do you think? Is this a big problem? Please vote. Let's find out. What do you think? Let's go to the next one and see what you think. Oh, so about half of you think that it's over 30%. And the rest are somewhere in the middle here. Let's find out on the next slide. Here we're talking about what is the value of having a PRO in the label as opposed to just publishing the data in a peer-reviewed journal or getting it out to the public some other way. Well, for industry sponsors, one reason why they want it in the actual label is that the presence of the claim in the label allows for the use of that statement of treatment benefit in their promotional material. So this is the answer to our polling question. Historically, off-label promotion of PRO claims has been an issue. There was a review published a few years ago which showed that of FDA warning letters and untitled letters issued between 2006 and 2012, about 1/5 of them, 19%, were for promotional claims related to PROs. So having the claim in the label would have helped to avoid that issue. Another reason why an industry sponsor might want to have a PRO claim in the label is so that it can be used as supportive data for payer reimbursement. And there'll be more to come on that topic in a future webinar in this series. But most importantly, for patients and clinicians, having this information accessible in the label can help to inform treatment decisions. This is especially important in therapeutic areas where the market is crowded, where there might be multiple options to choose from with roughly equivalent effectiveness and safety, and the PRO might be the differentiator. So having the claim versus not having the claim could be the reason why one treatment is chosen over another. So the FDA guidance was finalized in 2009. Since then, since we've had this guidance in place, how often have PRO claims been incorporated into the labeling of FDA-approved products? There was a review published last year which found that less than 20% of products approved by the U.S. FDA between 2011 and 2015 had PRO claims in their labeling. So maybe that's lower than we might have anticipated. So we did a little of our own original research to look at a few specific therapeutic areas to find out For novel new drugs approved by the FDA in the past 7 years, how many of the development programs for these drugs included PROs in their pivotal trials? And how many of those successfully obtained labeling claims? And for those that did assess PROs but were not granted labeling claims, why not? What were the reasons given for the rejection of those claims in the drug approval packages? So we're going to look at 4 different therapeutic areas, recent drug approvals in the areas of gastrointestinal disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and oncology. So we'll start off here with GI. So this is a therapeutic area where disorders sometimes don't have a clinical biomarker, so clinicians are often reliant on patients to tell them their symptoms. Things like abdominal pain, cramping, bloating, frequency of bowel movements, those are all patient-reported. So we might expect PROs to appear often in the labeling of these products. So what we found was that in this 7-year time frame of 2011 to 2017, there were 12 novel GI products approved, and 11 out of the 12 incorporated some form of PRO in their labeling. All of the PROs in the labeling described physical symptoms. But interestingly, 7 out of the 12 also included measures of health-related quality of life or functioning in the registration trials, but none of the drugs received labeling claims for those. In the drug approval packages, the reasons cited for rejection of those claims included use of a PRO instrument that did not meet the criteria outlined in the FDA guidance. Statistical issues were another problem, which included things like failure to adjust for multiplicity. And there are also some questions about how clinically meaningful some of the results were. So there may have been a statistically significant change on a particular scale, but how big of a difference did it really make to the patient? Next, we're going to look at PROs in the labeling of recently approved diabetes products. So as we know, diabetes is a chronic condition which requires patient self-management. So for the patient to achieve glycemic control, they really need to be engaged in their own care and they need to be adherent to their treatment. Since there's such a significant burden on the patient, we might expect that measures of treatment satisfaction or health-related quality of life would be especially important. What we found was that in the time frame that we studied, there were 11 novel drugs approved for antidiabetic indications, and none of the 11 were granted PRO claims in their labeling. We did find that 8 of the 11 collected data on treatment satisfaction or health-related quality of life during the course of their registration studies, but there were no comments provided in the drug approval packages with respect to the data, so we don't know what the reasons were for the rejection of those claims. So next we'll look at cardiovascular disease. This therapeutic area covers a lot of different conditions, but for the most part, treatment benefit has historically relied on objective clinical measures of morbidity and mortality. So hard endpoints like MACE, major adverse cardiovascular events, for example, in acute coronary syndrome. Today, because people are living longer, they're more likely to experience cardiovascular disease in their lifetime, and they're also more likely to survive after a cardiovascular event. So since more people are living with cardiovascular disease, this has created a heightened focus on the patient's experience. So we found that there were 13 novel drugs approved for cardiovascular indications in this time frame, and 3 of the 13 were granted PRO claims in their labeling. The 3 drugs that received the labeling claims were all indicated for pulmonary arterial hypertension, and they assessed some of the physical symptoms and the limitations of physical activity that are associated with that condition. 8 out of the 13 also evaluated additional PROs, including quality of life, but none were granted claims for those. A review of the drug approval packages found that it was for some of the same reasons we saw for other indications. Use of an inappropriate measure for the FDA guidance, statistical issues, and again, a questionable clinical meaningfulness. Lastly, oncology. So this is a therapeutic area that has a lot of unique challenges. One is that many cancers are orphan indications, so we're often talking about small sample sizes. Another challenge is that the design of clinical trials in oncology is often a single-arm, open-label design as opposed to randomized, double-blind, controlled clinical trials. That's the ideal as outlined in the FDA's PRO guidance. Another issue that seems to disproportionately affect oncology trials is missing data. As the trial goes on and patient's disease becomes progressive, the amount of missing data can become significant and it becomes problematic for the analysis. But regardless of these issues, much work is being done on PROs in this field, and interestingly, a recent study that incorporated PROs into a clinical trial of metastatic cancers showed that intervention based on the subject's responses resulted in improved survival. So despite the challenges, this study highlights the potential for PROs in this area. So for our analysis, we found that there were 60 novel oncology drugs approved during this period, which is huge compared to the other therapeutic areas we looked at where there was 11, 12, or 13 new drugs approved in the same time frame. And only one, which is Jakafi, which was approved in 2011 for myelofibrosis, was granted a PRO claim in their initial indication labeling. There were another 43 drugs that collected PRO data during the registration studies but did not receive claims in their initial labeling, and that was for many of the same reasons that we talked about. So the takeaways from our research, we found that most industry sponsors evaluated PROs in their registration studies, and I think that's a really important point. The majority of industry sponsors recognize the value of PROs and are actively working to incorporate them in their trials. However, as we saw, few obtained labeling claims. For those that were successful, the claims were limited to physical symptoms as opposed to measures of quality of life or treatment satisfaction. When we looked at the reasons why PRO claims were rejected, for the most part they were similar across indications. Many of them could have been anticipated based on the PRO guidance, and some upfront discussions with FDA might have been helpful. We're expecting a revision or a supplement to this guidance in the next 2 years per the 21st Century Cures Act directive, which should address some of the challenges associated with the current guidance and hopefully improve the numbers we're seeing here in terms of the number of products with PRO claims in their labeling. So this is our last slide, and now we're going to move into the question and answer portion of our presentation. During the Q&A, you'll also see some survey questions on your screen. We'd appreciate you providing your answers to them. And now I'll turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and move on to Q&A. Like Marjorie mentioned, feel free to answer the survey questions that will pop up. Just a reminder, there's still plenty of time to submit some questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So I'm just going to throw this one out to both of you. What is the biggest barrier to getting a PRO claim in a product label?
This is Marjorie. I can answer that one. I'd say the most common reason for rejection of PRO claims in the labeling is related to the PRO instrument itself and whether that instrument is fit for purpose based on the criteria outlined in the FDA PRO guidance. Oftentimes, existing PRO instruments, even if they've been around for years and even if there's a great deal of published information about them, they may still be missing key elements that are required by the guidance. I'd say the most common missing element would be the evidence of content validity, specifically the adequate documentation of patient input. That's really a huge challenge, and frequently we see industry sponsors making significant modifications to an existing instrument in order to meet the FDA standards. The other option is for a sponsor to create a brand new instrument specifically for that drug in that indication, just to be able to collect all the necessary evidence to meet the criteria in that guidance.
Todd, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't. I think Marjorie's answer was very comprehensive, so I do not.
All right, so our next question up is, does a PRO instrument need to be FDA qualified in order to support labeling claims?
You know, I'll take this one. This is Todd here. That's a good question. And I touched on this during the presentation, but I do think it's worth repeating in terms of the distinctions between the formal qualification process that FDA has versus developing a PRO instrument within the context of an individual development program. So the way I like to think about it is a sponsor is not required to get their PRO instrument formally qualified by FDA using that formal pathway prior to evaluating that instrument within the individual development program. So you can take an instrument that has no formal qualification and you can subject that to an individual development program and go through all the rigors and collect the data that are defined in the guidance documents and put forth by the agency. And so that particular type of instrument that goes through those hurdles during an individual development program would not be required to have formal qualification to actually produce data that would ultimately appear in the product labeling. So formal qualification is not required for the development of a PRO instrument within an individual development program that would ultimately result in marketing claims within the product labeling.
Okay, that looks like that's about, unfortunately, all the time we have for questions. I'd like to thank everyone for submitting, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Markets webinar. Also, thank you to our speakers for participating and Cardinal Health for presenting today's webinar. A reminder, this webinar has been recorded, and you will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.